Hi, everyone. Today we're going to begin talking about the water cycle. I know this is something some of you have studied in the past, but at a minimum, we need a refresher to make sure that we all understand the four basic processes that are happening. You should need to get a hold of me. My email address is on the screen. It is rcrawford@jcpsmail.org. So when we talk about the four main processes in the water cycle, we're usually going to be looking at a diagram, something like this. And those four main processes that I'm talking about are evaporation, transpiration, condensation, and precipitation. Now, you're going to see lots of water cycle diagrams that have many more words. And depending on how complex a diagram you have, it may be too much for sixth grade. But we're going to look at these four basic processes to begin with today, and we're going to start out with evaporation. So evaporation, as some of you may already know, is something that we can have not just in the water cycle, but this is something that happens to water, well, almost everywhere. So if we take, and I'm looking at this bottom left corner here, and I can see that I have a stove with a pot of water on it, and then I can see some steam above it. So evaporation is really, as it pertains to the water cycle, when the sun heats liquid water. Now that liquid water could be on the surface in a puddle, it could be in a lake, it could be in a stream, and it could be in the ocean. But when the sun hits liquid water on the surface and changes it into a gas. Now, when we have water as a gas, water in its gaseous state, we call that water vapor. So anytime we have liquid water changing to a gas, we call that gas water vapor. And that's what evaporation is. So I do want to point out that water vapor is completely invisible. It is single molecules of water that are moving into the atmosphere. So when we see this steam, steam itself is really not water vapor. Those are actually very tiny water droplets. How do we know that? Because we can see it. And water vapor itself is completely invisible. So evaporation, one of the key bits of evaporation is that evaporation allows water to move from Earth's surface and up into the atmosphere. Okay, so when we have water on Earth's surface, it is really just kind of stuck in that one location. It's not easy for it to move around, particularly once it gets to the ocean, even though we have some ocean currents, that's kind of where it's trapped. So evaporation is able to take water from the oceans and from anywhere else on Earth, and it is able to put it back up into the atmosphere. For most people, they like to imagine that evaporation is kind of that beginning of the water cycle, although we can start anywhere in the cycle. All right, so evaporation. Uh, Heated water moves from liquid to gas form, and this evaporation is going to move water up into the atmosphere. Okay. All right. So we're also going to look at transpiration. So transpiration here in this diagram, this says transpiration from plants. And really, transpiration is just a very special type of evaporation. Okay, so transpiration is still evaporation, but from plants. So I guess my definition is transpiration is when the sun heats liquid water inside plants and changes it to water vapor. And so once again, this is going to be water vapor that is going to be leaving Earth's surface and it's going to be moving up into Earth's atmosphere. So in on the bottom of most plant leaves, you have these tiny openings. We call them stomata, and this is where water vapor leaves from. For plants, this is just a very easy way for them to cool themselves when it's very hot. So transpiration, of course, is going to be happening a lot in the summer when plants are trying to cool themselves off. It's kind of like plant sweat, if you want to think about it like that. But as far as the water cycle is concerned, it is just a special type of evaporation, and it's just another way that water can move from Earth's surface into the atmosphere. All right, so now we've got water in Earth's atmosphere, and we're going to look at something called condensation. So condensation is when we have this water vapor that is in Earth's atmosphere, and it's carried upwards by winds, and it gets carried higher and higher up into the atmosphere. As it gets up higher and higher into the atmosphere, it's going to begin to cool down and it's going to begin to change state again. So condensation is just really when water vapor that's in the atmosphere begins to cool and it changes back into tiny droplets of water. So we turn it back into a liquid. And the reason this is important is because this is actually what clouds are. So condensation is what forms clouds. Now, many people think that clouds are made of water vapor. Remember, water vapor is completely invisible, so that's not true. Clouds are actually made of trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of tiny droplets of water. And so inside of these clouds, what's really happening is we have these tiny particles of dust also carried upward by the wind, and these water vapor molecules, they collide with it and they begin to stick to this particle of dust. And the more water molecules that stick to it, the bigger that these droplets get. So remember, we're at liquid water now. And eventually, a bunch of these cloud droplets or water droplets are going to be big enough to be seen and to form what we call a cloud. Okay, so condensation is water vapor that is cooling from a gas, and it's turning back into a liquid. Now, of course, you guys, if you've ever sat outside on a sunny day, you've watched clouds move around. So this is another way that clouds and water can move around move around Earth via the water cycle. Okay, so now we have water that's went from the surface, and we have turned it into a cloud as it is cooled. And the final bit of the water cycle that I want us to think about today is precipitation. And I think this is the one that most people are familiar with. So we have those water droplets that are inside of clouds, and they're going to continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger and heavier until eventually gravity overtakes them, and that water, that liquid water in the cloud, those droplets are going to fall to Earth's surface. And that's all precipitation is. And so the big deal here is that precipitation is going to move water back to Earth's surface from the atmosphere. Okay. Now, most of you know that precipitation can be in either a liquid form or a solid form. When we talk about liquid forms of precipitation, we're talking, of course, about rain. When we talk about solid forms of precipitation, we're talking about things like snow, sleet, and hail. Now, really what determines what happens to that water once it becomes so heavy and it falls from a cloud is the temperature. All right, so the temperature, if it freezes on its way down, we're going to end up with one of those solid forms of precipitation. If the air is warmer that it's falling through, most often it's just going to fall as rain. All right, guys. So as a reminder, when we look at the water cycle, we have evaporation and transpiration. Those are two ways that liquid water is turned into water vapor, which is water in its gas form, by the sun, by heat from the sun. And that's going to move it into Earth's atmosphere. So now we have water vapor in Earth's atmosphere, but as it travels higher and higher, it begins to cool. So that water vapor begins to cool again, and it turns back into its liquid state and forms these tiny droplets, which form clouds. Those clouds, of course, are free to move around in the atmosphere. And once those droplets inside of the clouds get heavy enough, they're going to fall back to Earth's surface as precipitation. And so, as you can see, we have water leaving the surface and moving to the atmosphere and then falling back to the surface. And then that cycle is going to begin over again. And sort of through evaporation, transpiration, and condensation and precipitation, that is the primary ways, the primary processes that move water around our surface. All right, guys, I think that's going to do it for the water cycle for today. I hope you have a wonderful day.